Nerves. So I want to talk a little bit, actually, I wanted to give a presentation on this topic for a while, considering I studied 20th century revolutions in college, but also, this is going to make me sound very young, I was a kid in post 9/11 America. So I remember looking at a map of this part of the world at that time and thinking, oh yeah, that's a thing. And very generally speaking, that thing stretched from like Western China to like the Ukraine, and then of course I would make a lot of broad generalizations, and no doubt I would use the words Arab and Muslim interchangeably. But of course, the truth is never that simple, and it never is simple. So today I'm going to talk about Iran, and just Iran, specifically the 1979 Iranian Revolution. I'm going to start where I love starting, with a little bit of context. So, if you talk to detractors, they'll often say that the 1979 Iranian Revolution was the first step towards the establishment of an isolated, fundamentalist state that supports terror organizations. And it might surprise you to hear me say that there is a bit of truth to that. But of course, that depends very much on who you're talking to and how old they are. So I'm going to start from the sort of beginning. Actually, it would have been a very long time ago. But the 1979 Iranian Revolution was a revolution to abolish the Pahlavi dynasty, which sounds cool, but this dynasty only had two kings, Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah. Before the Pahlavis, Iran was ruled by the Qajar dynasty, and before the Qajar dynasty, Iran was ruled by the Safavid dynasty. The Safavids and Qajars were responsible for two of some of the most important political changes in Iranian history that would have huge effects on the 20th century in Iran. First, the Safavids made Shia Islam the official state religion in the 16th century, and the second was the Qajars gave the ulama, or the Shia clergy, political power. And actually, now is a good time for a very short tangent, because having a very elementary understanding of Shia Islam is actually very important to having an understanding of 20th century Iranian history. So, most of the world's Muslims are Sunni Muslims, but the Shia Muslims, or Shiites as they're sometimes called, are another sect that began about 680 AD, and today they form the majority of Muslims in Iran and in Iraq. There's also sorry, 1 second. Come on, here we go. Will you excuse me for 1 second? Sorry about that, should have come prepared. Where was I? Oh yes. I love maps, and as you can see here of this map of the Middle East, Iran and Iraq are majority Shia Muslims. Iran is upwards of 95%, Iraq is about 2/3. There are significant Shia minority populations in countries like Syria and Yemen. They're also a majority in Azerbaijan, but as you can see, the remainder of the neighboring countries are mostly Sunni Muslims. The differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims could be a whole separate presentation, and frankly, we don't have that kind of time. So I'm just going to give you a very, very elementary understanding of the differences between Sunni and Shia Islam. Sunni Muslims believe that Abu Bakr, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, was rightfully chosen as the first caliph or successor to the Prophet Muhammad after the Prophet Muhammad's death. Shia Muslims believe that the first caliph should have been the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. Sunni Muslims believe that caliphs can come from anybody within the Ummah, which is the Islamic community, and Shia Muslims believe that caliphs can only come from the Prophet Muhammad's bloodline. Both sects has claimed that the other has distorted messages in the Quran, and again, that the doctrinal differences and the practical differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims could be a whole separate presentation, and we really don't have time for that. But one thing that's really important to understand about Shia Islam, and especially within the context of Iranian history, is from the very beginning, Shia Muslims have seen themselves as the sect of the oppressed, who stand up against the wealthy and powerful and harken back to the standards of social justice set by the Prophet Muhammad. And this connection between religious faith and social justice was critical for decades in most of the 20th century in Iran. And it's not, when we're talking about the 1979 Iranian Revolution, it doesn't really follow the narrative of a lot of British and American historians that the revolution was motivated by a fusion of Islam and late 20th century politics, because in the scheme of Iranian history, that's not really the case. 1979 actually was not Iran's first revolution. Iran's first revolution took place in 1906, and it forced the ruling Qajar dynasty to accept a constitution. This revolution created a parliament and supposedly some limits on the king, and it made Shia Islam the official state religion, but it also protected the rights of religious minorities in Iran. And this establishment of a constitutional monarchy in the first decade of the 20th century set a huge precedent in Iran for uprisings that lead to successful political changes. However, the Qajar dynasty would collapse just 15 years later due to the actions of this particular guy by the name of Reza Khan. He was an army officer supported by the British, and in a coup in 1921, he was proclaimed Reza Shah, the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. And his goals were fairly similar to if you studied modern Turkish history. He wanted to create a secular Western-style state, kind of like how Turkey was under Ataturk. His actions, especially in the 1920s and 30s, heavily strengthened Iran's central government authority. He imposed European-style dress. He gave women the power to participate in government, which is a big deal in that part of the world. And he very heavily curtailed the authority of the Shia clergy. He did, however, prove to be a pretty brutal autocrat in his own right, as his secular and religious contemporaries advocated for a more democratic and classically free government. He became considerably more violent and proceeded to put down a rebellion at the Gaharshan Mosque in 1935. Same year, actually, he changed the name of the country from Persia to Iran. And actually, this is a good time to remind people from Iran are not Arabs, they are Persians. And in Iran, they don't speak Arabic, they speak Farsi, or as we sometimes call it in English, Persian. They use the same alphabet, but it's a completely different language. But the thing is, during World War II, Iran was invaded by both the USSR and Great Britain in an attempt to solidify their imperial claims in Asia, and also to control their oil reserves. And during that time period, Reza Shah stepped down, and his son succeeded him as Shah, for the most part, until the late 70s, when he definitely stopped being the Shah then. So a big issue, geopolitically speaking, that Iran faced in the first 60, 70 years of the 20th century was foreign intervention in their politics. During both of the world wars, Iran was invaded by both the Russians and the British. Like I said, it was in an attempt to solidify their imperial claims. For the USSR, that would have been what is now Central Asian countries like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And for the British, that would have been in India. At least during the world wars, it would have been in India. But of course, Iran is one of the most oil-rich nations on earth, still is. And the British and the Russians wanted as much of that as possible in order to fuel their imperial ambitions and also their war machines during World War I and World War II. But of course, as Iran was incorporated into both of these wars, particularly World War II in the early 1940s, they experienced food shortages and high rates of inflation. So, the result, or how do I say this? Another thing that rubbed a lot of the common people in Iran the wrong way was the concession of oil to foreign investors and foreign governments. In the early 1920s, the British government established the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would allow the British government to have oil concessions from Iran's reserves. And also, again, much of their oil fields in, I don't have a map. 1 second. A lot of their oil fields up here in the kind of northern region of Iran were actually invaded and attempted to annex by the USSR. But, whoops, wrong slide. But of course, this fueled more nationalist and isolationist sentiment throughout the late 1940s, especially as the Cold War started brewing and many oil industry workers in Iran wanted a more nationalized sector. So by 1948, oil nationalization became an increasingly popular subject in Iran, as many Iranian politicians actually held what am I talking about? Royalties, sorry, I gotta get my economic terms right. Royalties within the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Many oil workers and lower classes in Iran saw this as forms of imperialism, or neo-imperialism. We would use the term neo-imperialism today. But the foreign interventions of Great Britain, the United States, and the USSR in the late 1940s in Iran's oil industry continued to spur more isolationist and anti-monarchy sentiment that would permeate throughout the rest of the century in Iran, as both secular intellectuals and religious intellectuals alike argued that Iran's government, in this particular case the early years of Mohammad Reza Shah, did not do enough to stop foreign intervention in their economy. So how did the people respond to foreign intervention? Well, they elected this man, Mohammad Mossadegh, as prime minister. He was the leader of Tudeh, the Iranian socialist, well, there were communist members, but it was the Iranian Socialist Party, and his anti-West politics and popularity unfortunately caused a rift between him and the Shah, as the Shah was still supported by the United States and by Great Britain. So, after his successful efforts to nationalize Iran's oil industry, beginning in 1951, in June 1953, the British and the CIA joined forces to overthrow Mossadegh by backing a coup attempt within the pro-Shah army units. These particular units stormed into Tehran and arrested Mossadegh. Now, that is something that most history books will tell you, that the CIA and the British engineered this coup d'etat in order to remove Mossadegh from office, which is true. It is 100% true that they attempted to engineer a coup. It is also true, however, that the Shia clergy encouraged this particular coup. They also encouraged demonstrations against Mossadegh following the coup, which seems kind of odd considering that Shia Islam traditionally takes a very radical stance against oppression. But you have to remember that Mossadegh was a socialist and was heavily implicated with the Iranian Communist Party. Nationalization of their oil industry is one thing, but further shifts toward communism might mean appropriation of land that the clergy used, maybe even rejections of religion entirely. So now again, I want to go back. This is example number 2 of the Shia clergy exerting their authority in political changes in Iran. The first one was in 1906, and the second one was again in 1953. So 10 years later, in 1963, the Shah announced a pretty big plan. It was known as, well, very colloquially, the White Revolution. It was a 6-point top-down modernization concept. And some of those policies included things like nationalization of forests and pastures, sale of government factories to private interests, and also the enfranchisement of women. And I'd like to emphasize again, that is a big deal in this part of the world. And in some ways, these attempts were successful. Oil revenues rose an estimated 4,000% between 1964 and 1976. And the Shah's government invested that revenue in infrastructure and education. The population grew, infant mortality fell, there was a new professional middle class that arose, and by these particular economic measurements, at least for most of the 1960s, Iran was shaping to be a secular Western-style state, again akin to Turkey under Ataturk in the 1920s. I gotta get my Turkish history right. The Shah again remained a close ally of the US government, who proceeded to supply him with weapons, and very crucially, as would have impacts on Iranian politics and history to this day, a nuclear reactor. That could be a whole separate presentation too. All right. I'm trying to not go off on too many tangents. Unfortunately, the White Revolution was not universally popular. It was particularly opposed by the Shia clergy, and of course one particular Shia cleric, a Sharia law scholar by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini spoke out against the White Revolution from the religious center of Iran, the city of Qom, most famously in 1963, where he was arrested for a speech that attacked the Shah's government and eventually sent into exile for the first time. He was exiled 3 times in his life. In 1964, interestingly enough, the US government, or the Iranian government, proposed a bill that would give diplomatic immunity to US military personnel who lived in Iran, and this was deeply unpopular with the Iranian population, who viewed the United States as, how do I say this politely? Sorry? The epitome of Western decadence. That's a pretty good way to put it, actually. And again, he gave another speech attacking the government for this proposed bill, and afterwards he was exiled to Turkey. And what he complained about specifically were a number of things. One of Khomeini's main complaints, especially as a very ultra-conservative Shia cleric, was that the reforms would grant more rights to women, particularly the right to vote. I know, scandalous. But he also attacked the government for, and this is a direct quote from one of his manifestos, the rigging of elections and other constitutional abuses, neglect of the poor, and the sale of oil to Israel. And remember what I said earlier about Shia Islam and one of their core tenets, one of the main beliefs that they hold? They see that they're inherently, or they're supposed to be anti-oppression. Khomeini, as a Shia cleric, felt that a king's power was inherently antithetical to Islamic teaching, and that Shia tradition was to fight against that kind of power. So, for that, he went into exile, but unfortunately, by the mid-1970s, things were not looking too great for Iran. Their economy was starting to struggle. The Shah, unfortunately, was found to have mismanaged oil revenues after the OPEC crisis. Did I say that right? Thank you. I was not alive. And his mishandling stretched the oil infrastructure beyond its resources. And unfortunately, the government tried to respond to this by attempting to institute new social programs like healthcare and schools, but they failed to address things like cost of living and the devaluation of their currency, inflation. Interestingly enough, also, in 1975, the Shah abolished Iran's 2 political parties and replaced them with one party, the Resurgence Party. You'll never guess who was resurging. Simple enough. And unfortunately, also for the Iranian populace, he terrorized them with a ruthless secret police known as the Savak. And they served the same purpose that every secret police force serves, to stifle dissent, to arrest people who dare to criticize the government. Yeah, does that sound familiar? That sounds a little bit familiar, huh? Yeah, that's what I thought. And interesting too, by 1978, there were an estimated 60,000 foreigners living in Iran, including 4,500 Americans. And this was deeply unpopular again with Iran's population. So, in the first half of 1978, demonstrations against the regime were led more by religious figures, Shia clerics, Islamic scholars, and with the support of the urban working classes, so industrial workers, basically anybody who didn't work in the farm sector. And I'm going to get to that in just a second, interestingly enough. But at that time period, what's important to remember is they faced a similar economic situation to sort of similarly to what we're dealing with now. Universities are turning out more graduates than there were jobs. The mechanization of agriculture had the sad effect of displacing farmers, many of whom moved to cities, particularly the capital city of Tehran. And as a result of being displaced to cities, many of them found themselves jobless and broke because there just weren't enough jobs for everybody. So one thing that I really want to make clear too is, in the beginning, particularly in 1978, few of the demonstrators were motivated to overthrow the monarchy because of a fundamentalist vision of Islam. They were dissatisfied with things like economic inequality, and political repression, and government corruption. So what really happened? Well, in January of 1978, an Iranian newspaper that was critical of Khomeini published a scathing article and prompted a series of demonstrations in Tehran, which then caused the military to fire on those demonstrations and kill them, and then led to more demonstrations. It's a vicious cycle that we've seen plenty of times before. And the rest of that year led to progressively more demonstrations. Protesters increasingly engaged in calculated violence, and their targets were symbols, or what they saw as symbols of not just the regime, but symbols of Western evil and imperialism. Things like nightclubs, movie theaters, banks, but also sabak stations, secret police stations. In August of 1978, there were religiously motivated students who started a fire at a cinema in Tehran, and they successfully spread the rumor that that fire was started by the government and not by the demonstrators. And this further contributed to the Shah's decreasing popularity. But, well, tragically, at the end of Ramadan in 1978, an anti-government demonstration began to spread across Tehran, and the Shah declared martial law, both in Tehran and also in 11 other cities in Iran. And, well, 4 days later, the Shah's army fired on a crowd of 20,000 demonstrators in Tehran and killed 122 people. That is known as the Jaleh Square Massacre. But of course, the power of the monarchy at this point was already starting to wane. Workers in the public sector and in Iran's oil industry began striking, demanding the same things that, well, most striking workers demand. A living wage, safe working conditions, very run-of-the-mill labor union sort of things. But these demands transformed into calls for political change when the movement joined momentum with wider anti-Shah movements. At this time as well, also Iran was experiencing a scarcity of fuel and raw materials. And unfortunately, private industries halted all proceedings by November 1978. In an attempt to hold on to power and somewhat sanitize his image, the Shah offered to release 1,000 political prisoners, but the damage was already done. People weren't going to rest until he was out of power. So in December 1978, hundreds of thousands of people throughout the entire country, and I will remind you that Iran has a population that today is about 100 million people. At the time, it would have been about 75 million people. So quite a lot. There were more violent demonstrations in December of 1978 between demonstrators and the Shah's army. And at this point, the Shah decided to enter negotiations with a member of Iran's parliament who advocated for the setup of a provisional government. A month later, in January 1979, the Majils, or Iranian parliamentarians, voted in favor of a politician by the name of Shapur Bakhitar to form a provisional government, provided that the Shah fled Iran, which he did so on January 16, 1979, as news began to spread all over the country that the government had fallen. Well, what happened after that? Well, Shapur Bakhitar lifted press restrictions, he freed more political prisoners, and he promised to dissolve the Sabak. However, Khomeini led more demonstrators to advocate for a completely new government. And on January 29th, 1979, millions demonstrated in the streets of Tehran, after Khomeini called for a street referendum, which sounds like a very polite way of saying uprising. I love how polite that sounds. I don't know why, for some reason, it just makes me think, delightful. In February 1979, as Khomeini returned from exile, at the time he was living in Paris, the military began to dissolve their loyalty to the Shah and proclaim their loyalty to Khomeini. And unfortunately for Bahitar, he was sent into hiding as the government fell completely into rebel hands. What followed after this provisional government that lasted for just about a month and a half was this, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Interestingly enough, Khomeini, as a Shia cleric, didn't see himself as accountable to a secular rule of law. He could appoint government ministers. He could name representatives. He could approve representatives. He could approve political candidates during elections. And he was also to share power with the Iranian prime minister as a joint venture between the Iranian prime minister and the Revolutionary Council, which was an institution that Khomeini established in January 1979 in order to oversee the religious changes within Iran's government, and also to protect them from coup attempts. New revolutionary courts, unfortunately, were established to punish collaborators and anybody who might have been associated with the former regimes, like officers, pro-Shah military personnel, diplomats, cabinet ministers, and even some Iranian politicians, parliamentarians, were tried and executed by the new revolutionary courts in mid-1979. Officially, if you ever read a history book about this, many of them will say that there was an open referendum on whether or not to form an Islamic Republic, and that in that open referendum in March of 1979, the vast majority of the population voted yes. You should know, however, that there was only one option on that ballot. I'm sure many of you can put together that that was far from a free or fair election, or referendum. Sorry, I got my political term right. So after that referendum, that of course only had one option on it, Khomeini established the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the constitution was rewritten in order to give the basis for clerical domination and to give ultimate authority to Khomeini as the faqih, or today in the West we refer to them as ayatollahs. And I'm going to get more into that structure in just a few minutes, but one thing that we all remember the Iranian Revolution for, especially in this country, was a hostage crisis. Did everybody here see that movie Argo? Okay, you should know that that movie's very over-dramatized, but I do remember seeing that when I was probably 13 or 14, and I remember thinking, so this actually happened, and I started looking into it, and I was like, well, it's not quite as simple as just an angry mob breaking into an embassy. The truth is, Khomeini feared coup attempts, and he feared attempted retaliation by the United States. And so, as the Shah sought refuge in the United States for cancer treatment, which many in the new Islamic Republic government saw as dubious, the provisional government leaders actually met with President Carter in 1979 in Algeria, and after this particular meeting, hundreds of thousands of people protested in Tehran, and many students stormed the United States Embassy and held 52 people hostage. 2 days after the protests broke out, however, Barzaghan, who was the provisional prime minister for the first few months of the Islamic Republic, resigned from his role, and the Revolutionary Council took over to some of the prime minister's functions until a new election could be held. And of course, these hostages, as many of you remember, were not freed until over a year later. And tragically, someone help me out here. What's the word for when it's not exile, well, it is kind of exile.
Asylum?
It is kind of asylum too, actually. The asylum of the Shah in the United States led to the complete diplomatic breakdown of any kind of relation between the US and Iranian governments.
He went to the United for an operation and he had cancer and that was...
Yes. The official story he gave was he had cancer and he was in the United States for treatment. Unfortunately, the Iranian public did not buy that story. So, what kind of government does Iran have now? Well, when you hear the word Islamic Republic, what does that conjure up to some people? Spit it out.
Not revolutionary guard, not citizen.
So I heard the word theocracy. Well, yeah, in a certain respect, Iran is a theocracy. Because in a theocracy, the ultimate will, or the ultimate authority of government does not come from the will of one person or a few people or the people. It comes from the will of God. And written into Iran's constitution today, the ultimate authority in that country is not the will of the people, it is the will of God. So yes, in that respect, Iran is a theocracy. Much of the power in Iran is unfortunately held by a cabal of conservative clerics who force religious compliance at home and pursue a very aggressive foreign policy abroad. They are widely believed, well, at least as of a few years ago, they are widely believed to be supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Hamas in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and are funders of the terrorist organization Hezbollah. Whether or not that's actually the case, I'm not an intelligence expert. Someone will have to confirm that independently. But in some respects, well, if holding elections means that a country is a democracy, then yeah, Iran in that respect is a democracy because they hold elections for parliament and for president and for various other politicians. And contrary to popular belief, women actually can vote in Iran, and they do. And there are women politicians and parliamentarians. But you should know that the group of Sharia law scholars and the Ayatollah are always men, and they are, how do I say this in a polite, respectful way? I'm sorry, I'm at work, I'm trying to be nice. They are rigid. There we go, that's a good one. They're rigid. And unfortunately, the Islamic Republic of Iran is still a highly repressive and authoritarian government. For example, they execute a very high percentage of criminals. Among other things, they have a particularly strict and ruthless implementation of Sharia law, which, again, could be a whole separate presentation. People have disagreed about what that means for centuries. So, what kind of government is Iran? Well, it's a theocratic republic. That makes which sounds like it makes no sense because it does make no sense. But they have elections and they have a legislature, but all of their policies have to be in line with Islamic law. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, cool. Then that answers my question. So how does the Iranian Revolution compare? This is my favorite part of every single historical subject that I study, is how does it compare to any other event in history? Well, we've had plenty of revolutions throughout history. Most of us here are aware of the American Revolution because we live in the United States. But I think in a lot of ways Iran is a little bit more like the French or Russian Revolution in that they replaced one authoritarian government with another authoritarian government. And ultimately, I mean, who knows how long that's going to last, considering certain geopolitical things that are happening as we speak. But, yeah, in the respect of a people rising up against a government because they see that government as unresponsive to their needs, yeah, the Iranian Revolution fits in with a lot of other revolutions throughout history. But I think I compare it the most, personally, to the French or Russian Revolution in that they didn't really do anything to, or the new government that followed the previous government was still a highly repressive and, I'm trying to think of a good word to use, English. A highly repressive and
Non-democratic.
rigid, yeah, non-democratic government. That's a good way to put it, actually. So, I mean, I'm sure, can anybody else here think of any other kind of comparison from somewhere else in history? Just spit it out, popcorn style.
Russian revolutions?
Russian, yep, that's similar. The USSR definitely was repressive and authoritarian, much like the Tsar. Anybody else? Cuba? Oh yeah, Cuba, that really makes sense. Someone said North Korea? Yeah, that's fair. That's really fair.
Yes.
The Chinese would have took decades.
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, from between the fall of imperial China to the establishment of People's Republic, yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. But yeah, this is it's definitely something that I think that I was thinking about as I put this together, because I was like, okay, well, people want like a baseline or something to compare events to, or at least I do whenever I read history books or watch documentaries about this sort of thing. And I just remember thinking, okay, well, it's not really like the American or French revolutions, just because the politics are so different and the motivations are so different. But I think in a lot of ways it's very like the Russian or whoever said Cuban revolution as well. But yeah, definitely just a interesting and very provocative thought. And now I would love to open the floor up for some questions if anybody has any. And would it help if I grab a wireless microphone so we can pass it around? Okay, cool. I'll be right back. This will take about 5 seconds. Okay, I have returned, and I will pass this to whoever has their hand at it. Just pass this to you.
It's hot, yes.
There we go.
Okay, so one very puzzling aspect of this whole thing is there's a repression that is supported by a very violent group of armed individuals.
Indeed.
And yet there also is a very strong military in Iran.
Yes, there is.
And how all those groups are kind of interacting with each other and who really is in control is just totally confounding to me.
I think it's been compounding to us for decades.
It seems the military is kind of just standing on the sidelines and letting things play at a street level, but I don't really believe that's probably true.
I have a hard time believing that as well. I also have a hard time believing that that's true. In every country, the high command of the military has some kind of political inclination, whether they profess it or not. And I find it hard to believe that no senior Iranian military leader has some kind of opinion that goes against the establishment of Iran's civilian government. But of course, what do I know? I'm just a lowly kid from Seattle, and there is a hand up right behind you, Ed, so if you feel like passing the microphone, thank you very much.
Yeah, could you say a little bit about what's happened with the oil industry?
The oil industry?
Yeah, since the revolution.
Well, that's the thing. Since the revolution, Iran has taken a little bit more state control, but of course much of that has been privatized to individual Iranians, as it was during the late 1960s and early 70s. So there's foreign investors, but of course, most of that was sold off to private Iranians during the White Revolution. And it is worth knowing as well that due to the sanctions that they've been under since the early 2010s, the value of the value of Iran's oil has been greatly affected, and so has their ability to export, which is kind of bizarre considering it's such an oil-rich country. Anybody else? There's a couple of hands behind you. Alan, why don't you just pass the microphone? Cool.
I bet you've been thinking about this. I wonder if you could say anything about it. The fact that the Shah's son is now presenting himself as a possible alternative to the government in Iran now. And given, you know, all the demonstrations that are going on, I don't know if you would call this a revolutionary uprising or not.
Well, I'll believe it when I see it. No, I do know what you're talking about. I just, given how rigid the governance structure of Iran's government is, I think it's going to take more than foreigners protesting outside their embassies to really cause any government change. I couldn't tell you if, you know, the people in the Iranian diaspora, because there is a very large diaspora, or at least there has been for the last probably 45 years. I couldn't tell you how many of them are really all that invested, but I mean, who knows? If enough of them are, it could cause a shift in public opinion abroad. And if that shift in public opinion abroad has any effect inside, I think, yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, this is probably pretty peripheral to much of what you've told us. But my wife was from Iran. I met her over here, and we married. And I recall when the Shah was overthrown, her two brothers, a bit older, called on the phone, and they were just like giddy kids. Oh, it's so wonderful. Everything's going to be so much better. And that lasted for about a week. And then absolutely no more commentary on that. Our son did play with the son of a diaspora couple. He was a physician. Most of the people who came over were upper middle class, could afford to do it.
Right.
But anyways, just a few thoughts.
I'm fascinated. Well, if you ever feel like sharing those, please. Sorry, next person.
Just to remind you that in the Second World War, with the Allied invasion in Normandy, do you know where the oil came from for the Allies?
I'm going to go off on a limb here. I guess.
Brought from Iran.
Yep.
By tankers all the way to Scotland.
I knew it.
Piped down from Scotland to stations all along the English coast opposite France, and then piped under the channel. So it all came from Iran.
At the
The
behest
question
of
was, who paid for that oil?
I'm sure it was at the behest of the Anglo-Iranian oil
Nobody
company.
paid for it.
Nobody paid for it.
So
Interesting.
it was taken.
Of course
So,
it was.
And it makes me think a little bit about what's happening in Venezuela now. Who's taking the oil there?
Yeah,
So there's a kind of legacy of Western, the taking of the prize of oil in other countries. So
I think that's interesting.
Thought.
And that's also very accurate, not just in Iran, but also during the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
and maybe
Plenty of others.
our president's recent threat to do something to Iran may end up by taking Iran's oil.
Wouldn't shock me. Wouldn't put it past him. I see another hand up.
very valid point that there was a succession of revolutions in which one repressive regime took over from a previous repressive regime. What do you think is the likelihood that another repressive regime will now take over as Khomeini is apparently on his last legs, physically and politically? The current.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Khomeini died about
Yeah, no, it's not
30 years ago.
Who's the president?
The current, they have another Ayatollah who is near the end of his life.
Yeah.
That's hard to say. I really couldn't tell you. What I do know is that anti-Western views are less common among younger people in Iran. It's like people my age, people who were born after the revolution. Younger people in Iran do tend to be a little bit more progressive, at least by Iranian standards. I don't know if that will translate to any kind of political change. I don't think anybody does. Definitely something to think about. Someone else would like to? Hi, Al. Sorry about that.
So, Iran's support for international revolutionaries or international terrorists, however you see it, like the Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas, is that motivated primarily by religious motivation, political
Kind of.
motivation, anti-Zionism?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because actually that could also be a whole separate presentation as the geopolitics of the Middle East, with the contemporary geopolitics of the Middle East. Very simply put, Iran and Saudi Arabia have been engaged in like a, dare I use the word, Cold War, a competition for influence, for geopolitical influence for the last, ever since the revolution. And as a means of proxy combat, Iran has been arming Shia militia groups in countries like, well, maybe not so much anymore, but they were at one point in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. Thank you, Yemen. And the Saudi Arabian government is funding Sunni militia groups because of the religious split between the two countries, but also to serve their own interests, right? The way that Saudi Arabia sees the regional order is Saudi Arabia wants a stable Middle East, or at least a stable Arab world, and they would like to avoid any overthrow of a sclerotic, autocratic government. Iran is kind of, how do I say this? Iran is kind of the anti-status quo power in that conflict. They've been trying for decades to overturn the regional order. And by funding insurgency groups in countries like Yemen, or maybe not so much anymore, but when the conflict in Syria was more prevalent, and by funding insurgency groups in countries like Syria, they saw that as a means of changing the regional order into their favor. But like I said, that could be a whole separate presentation. Someone, I'm sure, if anybody wants to give a Saturday Matters talk, that might be a interesting subject. Wink, wink. But yeah, just a crash course, SparkNotes version of why.
Chris, I came in late, and so I haven't heard everything.
No.
But I am curious this is the first presentation you've made, right?
No.
Oh, you have done others.
About 6.
Lots.
Okay, I guess I haven't attended them.
That's okay.
I was just curious why you chose this subject and what got you interested in, is it just that country or the general Middle East?
I'm always fascinated by political changes, very, not sudden, but very stark political changes. And one of my favorite classes when I was in college was Revolutions of the 20th Century, which very much included the Iranian Revolution, but it also included revolutions like in Russia and Cuba. And I've actually wanted to give a talk about this for a while, but just the timing never really came up, and then December was chaos. I had a million things to do in December. I couldn't fit a presentation in. So to answer your question, because I was interested, I hope that satisfies some people's curiosity. Sorry, Judy, just if you wouldn't mind, yeah, passing the mic.
It certainly has affected the United States dramatically over the last 30 years. The price of
Very much so.
oil. When I was a commissioner of revenue in Alaska, we had our eyes on what was happening in the Middle East almost daily.
Oh yeah.
And the great affecting the Alaskan oil was the worry.
Instability does not really do wonders for the price of commodities. You don't need a PhD in economics to know that. Anybody else? I know we're getting close to dinner time, sorry. This is your last chance. And there it went. Thanks everybody for coming. I'll be around.